Welcome to Surreal Noir. I'm your host, Kate Laity.
Oh, God. It's okay. No, please don't be afraid. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. My name is Robert Forrester.
Just stand right there. Please.
You gonna call the police? You should call the police. You probably should, I think. Look, it's no excuse, but... I'm leaving.
What?
What?
What were you gonna say?
I was gonna say that... Look, can I be honest with you? I've been here a few times before, okay? I just watch you in the kitchen doing stuff. Listening to music, cooking, cleaning, nothing else. I know that sounds really bad, but it's innocent. I swear to you. You look so happy. You make me feel happy, huh? Lately I've felt very lonely and depressed. I promise you I will never come here ever again, ever.
Depression can crush you.
You know about that?
Do you want to come in?
What?
If we're gonna talk, I'd rather do it inside.
And that was a clip from the 2009 film version of The Cry of the Owl by Patricia Highsmith. And welcome to Noirvember and the 5th episode of Surreal Noir. That film, I'm writing about that film for an upcoming issue of Film International that has a noir focus and is a joint production with Retreats from Oblivion, which is the journal for NoirCon, the Noir Festival. So pretty much a noir month. So my students have recently finished reading The Cry of the Owl, so much of it on my mind. The other thing this month, though, was the International Society for the Study of Surrealism. There's some nice lisping for you. Had their global conference this month, which was quite amazing. My first attendance at the conference. And, well, there were many things to experience. I still haven't finished because, fortunately, there was so much going on that it was all recorded, and so I can listen on catch up, and there are additional art performances and such, so it's something well worth thinking about for the next one, because it's going to be, it really is just jam-packed with wonderful surreal stuff, and much more I have yet to experience. My own little contribution was a presentation on the Leonora Carrington short story, My Mother is a Cow, which, I argued, had a lot to do with her reading of Robert Graves' The White Goddess. And so I traced some of the possible tracks between his book and her story. But I thought maybe a place to start to give you a little sense of it is to read the opening of the story, which is surreal, to be sure, magical, and deeply imbued with mythology and the goddess, of course. In Graves' popular presentation of the goddess, he was the one to really position this tripartite goddess as Maiden Mother and Crone, which still has quite an influence on readings of mythology. Not all tripartite goddesses necessarily break into that age pattern, but it was certainly very powerful for Carrington's imagination. She called it one of the most influential things she'd ever read. And Susan Aberth, who's the key scholar to know on Leonora Carrington, says the impact of the book just cannot be overestimated. It really did influence her in so many ways. Now, Carrington, of course, was influenced by many of her researches into mythology and folklore and magic, of course. Magic and the occult. And you can certainly see some of that in this story, too. So just the beginning of My Mother is a Cow. Our family is modest. My mother is a cow. Or rather, my mother is a cow-faced fan. Who is she? And does she also live behind her fan self? A face before a face before a... Who am I to say? We ask here, who are you? She laughs, but receives offerings of a kind. We call her Holy One, if we know her, but we are very few. Our small sanctuaries are empty, containing only my mother's horned face. Each of us gives what we have to offer. The offerings are returned to human beings as small truths, great truths, medium truths, or quite often as lies and fibs. It all depends on what we do with them. The offerings in the first place are quite devious. Tears and honey, shrieks and tobacco, burning resin, chocolate, white nights. Red ochre, whitewash, and soot. The last three elements there are the colors that recur in many of Carrington's paintings, and they are the colors that are essential to the study of alchemy. They're also very often the colors that we find in cave paintings. So there's this wonderful sense of the ancient that breaks through in her very modern and often surreal paintings. It's a great story, and it's certainly one that I recommend. And that was Wendy Rule with Underworld Queen. The character in My Mother is a Cow is a captive. She's imprisoned, not alone, but with others. But the people who are keeping her there are very strange. This is how she describes them. For years I have been a prisoner of the people of the set now called the Watchers. These great hypnotists have no idols. Their magic is powerful and their appetite insatiable. They thrive on misery, but have great delicacy in choosing their victims. They evoke compassion, but have none themselves. They possess unlimited knowledge, but have no understanding, and this gives them the power of absolute, concentrated hate. She is a victim held captive by these people, but not alone. She has some companions, especially a sailor who had once sailed with Ulysses. But he is more fearful than she and unwilling to put himself out there to take the steps especially in the very dangerous and difficult dance. The dance where she says, every mistake we make in these dances must be turned into a question. Otherwise, they are fatal to our human condition. It's very much a story about asking the right questions, and only through asking questions that you can find the truth within yourself, that you can find the right answers. And in fact, at one point, she berates herself for having cried and begged and pleaded, and then realizing that she hadn't asked any questions. So, of course, her mother was not answering her. The sailor shows a good aspect of her difficult or stumbling steps, her almost limping dance, because she's being maimed even as she's attempting to keep the dance going. And he's given up. He's kind of watching from the sidelines. His sanctuary has been sealed up. He's not even willing to use it. And she tells him, I went on dancing in my grotesque disguise, but not before I told him, I am lonely and miserable, but I am wearing my last skin. Since you are almost face to face with the gods, do not abandon me. In human language, this is called love. Within the story, she talks about mannequins and creating mannequins, all the layers of the people we're supposed to be that get between people. And yet, this is how humans converse, by creating these mannequins, creating these versions of themselves they're supposed to be. And it's only by stripping them away, Carrington argues in the story, that you can truly be yourself and glimpse into, I don't know, how would you describe it, the infinite. But this sense of the truth and the reality behind things. And it comes from asking these questions, and it comes from giving up on those mannequins. It's a strange little story, but it's just so arresting, and the imagery is so evocative, especially the dancing in a spiral. If you know anything about spiral dancing, it's difficult to do correctly, but amazing when you see it and when it works. And there's some huge spiral dances that, well, used to, who knows, in the before times, as we sometimes say now, enormous spiral dances that are just amazing to watch. They're very easy to go astray, but if you have a large group of people, it's just the flow, watching people in the flow of dance, well, any kind of dance performance. You see the beauty and the discipline of it, but you also see the magic that it makes, watching those shapes go, watching the shapes on the stage unfold. It's really arresting. And even if you're cavorting, as she says, on bloody stumps, you can still make the dance beautiful. And that was Diagba from Inanna. A nice drum sound there. My other text for this episode is Patricia Highsmith, The Cry of the Owl. I've been teaching a course, Highsmith at 100, since it is the 100th anniversary of her birth. And just this month, a collection of her edited journals and letters came out. And I'm going to be picking that up this week, which should be fascinating to read. And I'm sure there's just the tip of the iceberg, because she not only kept a journal, she kept 2 journals, one of which was very frank and one of which was more professional, I suppose you could say, that it was about her writing and her process, which she wrote about a little bit in a nonfiction work called Plotting and Writing Suspense Fiction. But The Cry of the Owl is a book that over time I've come to enjoy it more and more. There's been 2 films made from it. The 2009 one that I gave a clip from. The other one, a French version directed by Claude Chabrol. And I think this is one of my pet peeves kind of with French film versions of Highsmith, that they seem to always come down to the idea that it's really just about sex. And with Highsmith, it's never just about sex, and sometimes it's not at all. The most recent, well, until the television program comes out, most recent film version of The Talented Mr. Ripley, Anthony Mingala's version just went with Ripley's gay and he's in love with Dickie Greenleaf. And I think it's so much more complicated than that, because if you look at the one moment of true ecstasy in Ripley's story, the first one anyway, it's not thinking about Dickie and it's not imagining himself with Dickie. It's when he's on the train with all the stuff that used to belong to Dickie and now it's his. And that is his moment of pure ecstasy. So I think it's something much more complicated. And with The Cry of the Owl, and similarly, The Sweet Sickness, the French versions where it comes down to sex and not having sex, and the obsession is so much more about the whole of life, not just not just sex. Sex isn't the only thing. There's so much more to it. How can you read the passage from Carol? Oh, this is another thing that came out this week, a short story version that is sort of the first stab at the Carol story. And it not only has the milk moment, which I just find endlessly fascinating, this idea of the comfort. And certainly there is very much a mother-daughter issue with Patricia Highsmith. Oh, there's huge mother issues. But this scene where Carol gives Therese the glass of milk before she goes to bed, it's very much a moment about comfort. And yes, I'm hearing Kate Bush in my head. Mother stands for comfort. Well, it didn't for Patricia Highsmith in any case. But there's a line that I really don't remember from the novel, but is in this short story about as they're driving through the Lincoln Tunnel, that she just wants it to, I forget now the name, the protagonist isn't Therese, but it's something similarly sort of vaguely French. But she wants the tunnel to just fall and crush them so that she can die while everything is perfect. And this is another motif that comes up in The Cry of the Owl, which has people and their assumptions and their projections onto other people. I was very curious to hear students' first impressions of the main character, Robert Forster, who we first meet right at the beginning of the novel, when he is kind of being a stalker, which is something, again, something Highsmith was not unknown to do, but it deliberately provokes, I think, the reader to make assumptions which are mitigated by what Highsmith tells us, and also set us up to misread other characters. So here's Robert Forster, who's not in a good state of mind. This must be said, and he's not happy, and his life is kind of a shambles as far as he's concerned. But he's found one thing that seems to help. He wanted to see the girl again, maybe for the last time, he thought. But he had thought that before, and no time before had been the last time. He wondered if the girl was why he had worked late today. when he had not needed to work late. If he had stayed late, just to be sure it would be dark when he left the plant. Robert left his car in a lane in the woods near the girl's house and walked. When he reached her driveway, he walked slowly, kept going past the basketball goal at the end of the driveway, and entered the grassy field beyond. The girl was in the kitchen again. Its 2 squares of light showed at the back of the house, and now and again her figure crossed one of the squares, but stayed mostly in the left square, where the table was. To Robert's view, the window was like the tiny focus of a camera. He did not always go closer to the house. He was very much afraid of being seen by her, of being hauled in by the police as a prowler or a peeping Tom. But tonight was a very dark night. He moved closer to the house. It was the 4th or 5th time he had come. The first time he had seen the girl was on a Saturday, when he had been rambling about the country in his car, a bright, sunlit Saturday in late September. She had been shaking out a small carpet on the front porch as he drove by, and he had seen her perhaps only for 10 seconds. Yet that image had struck him like a scene he knew, a picture or a person he had already knew from somewhere. From the cardboard curtains on the front porch and the curtainless windows, he supposed she had just moved in. It was a 2-story white house with brown shutters and brown trim, much in need of painting, and the lawn was overgrown, and the white rail fence along the driveway collapsing and askew. The girl had light brown hair and was rather tall. That was about all he had been able to tell about her from a distance of 60 feet or so. Whether she was pretty or not, he couldn't tell, and it hadn't mattered. What had mattered? Robert could not have put it in words, but the 2nd and 3rd times he had seen her at 2 and 3 week intervals, he had realized what he liked, and that was the girl's placid temperament, her obvious affection for her rather ramshackle house, her contentment with her life. All this he could see through the kitchen window. Of course, when we're talking about Highsmith, nothing is ever as it seems. And unlikely as it seems, the stalker is accidentally seen by the stalkee, and rather than alerting the police, as you heard in the clip, she invites him inside. Now, she has a boyfriend, a fiancé, in fact, and he has a pretty much done ex-wife, and an ex-wife who is allegedly based on Highsmith's own ex, Mary Jane Meeker, who's probably better known as Vin Packer, pulp fiction writer, or M.E. Kerr, the children's writer. It is not a flattering portrait, if so, and I suppose it's possible that there could be some shreds of truth about it, but it's certainly a very vicious portrait. The character of Nikki is the one students are like, yeah, I didn't like her, and she didn't get any better as the book went on. But the difference between our first impressions and what we learn as the story goes along, it's a huge, huge gap. And that was Björk with Loss, which seems an appropriate noir sort of emotion. In The Cry of the Owl, there are many people suffering a sense of loss and dealing with it in very different ways. The woman that Robert watches, Jenny Tiroff, has had losses in her past, and she has losses in her future too. It's a Highsmith novel. This is going to happen. But this illusion of happiness and contentment that Robert sees from outside the window looks very different from inside the house. And Highsmith tips her hand, as she often does, with what the characters are reading, just as Mr. Greenleaf suggests to Tom that he read Henry James' The Ambassadors, which gives us a hint of what lies ahead. In this novel, Jenny is reading Dostoevsky's The Possessed, also known as The Devils, which is about revolutionaries, and Dostoevsky was very much not on their side. And one of the characters who ends up committing suicide as a gesture to the rest of the revolutionaries, in part, and it's grossly oversimplifying, but it's one of the reasons that I warn the students in advance if they, well, like many of Highsmith's novels, it deals with people in emotional turmoil, but it also deals quite directly with mental illness and the issue of suicide. So I'm telling students if this is something that was going to make them feel really uncomfortable, that I would be happy if they chose another book or read something else. And there are a couple of students, because it's a hard time right now for everybody. And a number of students I've had that are just really, really having difficult times. And it's harder, I think, especially when you're young. And when things look bleak, they can look very, very bleak. And when you get older, I think in many ways it's easier to roll with the punches, which is not to belittle the fact that despair is, there's a lot of it out there. It's a hard time right now. Well, it's always a hard time, isn't it? We're just more aware of it, I think, at present. But this is a book that deals with suicide. And like the moment I mentioned in Carol, there's a moment where Jenny says that if there were poison in the cup in front of her, that she would take it because she's so happy. And that seems so counterintuitive to many that it's a fascinating point. But after the opening chapter where we see Robert watching Jenny, we then, through the magic of narration, we step inside to the house and we see things from Jenny's point of view. So she and her fiancé, Greg Wincoop, are watching television. They're watching a murder mystery series, which the episode was not particularly interesting, but they, on the whole, liked the series. So Jenny stared, unseeing, into the screen. She was thinking of a book she was reading, Dostoevsky's The Possessed. She did not understand Kirillov, at least not his last speech, a long one. But there was no use asking Greg about it. Greg had read the book, he said, but the question she might have asked him, though clear before dinner, now seemed nebulous to her. But she had no doubt that when she finished the book, or maybe a few days after she finished it, she would be sitting in the bathtub or washing dinners one evening, and it would all become clear and inevitable. "What are you thinking about?" Greg asked. Jenny, embarrassed, sat back and smiled. "Do I always have to be thinking about something? You're always asking me that." So the thoughts on her mind, she's unwilling to share. And Kirillov is the character, of course, who commits suicide. And it seems likely that her questions have to do with his choice there. But then she doesn't ask the question. And as we know from My Mother is a Cow, you've always got to ask the questions. It's interesting just how much of a difference that makes and how it changes our views of the character. We see a much more thoughtful side of Jenny than certainly what Robert sees initially, only seeing and not hearing her. And at a certain point, well, we see a lot of characters who don't actually hear what others are saying and don't take that information in. when Robert and Jenny meet, as we heard in our first clip at the beginning of the show, they have a conversation which touches on their relative states of mental health and why it is that Robert has been watching her. And this picture of contentment that he's enjoyed turns out to be, of course, much more complicated. Do you believe in strange encounters? He looked at her face. What do you mean? I mean accidents, I guess. Like my meeting you tonight. They're in all the great books. Well, not all, I suppose, but a lot of them. People who meet by accident are destined to meet. It's so much more important than being introduced to someone. Because that's just a matter of someone else knowing them already and introducing you to them. I met Greg, he's my fiancé, through Rita at the bank where I work. But some of my closest friends I've met by accident. She spoke slowly and steadily. You mean you believe in fate? Of course. And people represent things. Her eyes looked distant and sad. Yes, he agreed vaguely, thinking she had certainly represented something to him before he ever spoke to her, but now? She did not seem to have the wisdom, the common sense, perhaps, that he had attributed to her when he watched her through the window. And what do I represent to you? I don't know yet, but something. I'll know soon, maybe tomorrow or the next day. She lifted her coffee cup at last and sipped. The time I was depressed, there was a stranger in the house, a friend of my father's staying with us a few days. I didn't like him, and I felt he represented death. Then a week after he left, my little brother came down with spinal meningitis, and then he died. Robert stared at her, shocked to silence. Death was the last thing he had expected her to talk of, and her words reminded him of his own dream, his damned, recurrent dream. What do I represent to you? He cleared his throat, embarrassed. A girl with a home, a job, a fiancé, a girl who's happy and content. She laughed, a slow, soft laugh. I've never thought of myself as content. People never do, I suppose. It's just the way you look to me. I was feeling low and you looked happy to me. That's why I like to look at you. He did not feel he had to apologize or be ashamed of that anymore. She wasn't the kind of girl who'd assume he had been watching her undress. She seemed too innocent for that. What were you depressed about? She asked. Oh, nothing that I can talk about. He frowned. None of this makes any sense, unless I say that life is meaningless unless you're living it for some other person. I was living for you since September, even though I didn't know you. He scowled at the table, feeling he had just delivered a minor Gettysburg address. The girl was going to laugh, ignore it, or just say, mm-hmm. She sighed. I know what you mean. I really do. But Jenny, of course, is making assumptions and projecting ideas of her own onto Robert, just as he had been doing to her. Only now that he's met her, he begins to accept the reality of who she is. But she begins to become obsessive, and she's not the only one. Not surprisingly, her fiancé is not too happy about her new friend. And Robert's ex is not willing to let go. It's a very suspenseful little story that just gets tighter and tighter as it goes along. And Robert, who at the start seemed, in addition to deeply depressed, just unable to act or do anything, begins to seem like the person with the most stability. And maybe some of that is from finding and meeting Jenny. But it also, as she begins to talk about her concept of death as someone who just shows up in your life, his actions inadvertently, and sometimes almost comically so, unleash terrible events. And it's not anything he does deliberately, and it's not anything that he wants to happen. It's just as if he were some kind of cursed specter thrown into these other lives, a strange whirlwind. But it's a very gripping read, and I think right down to the very end, you're kind of turning the pages going, wait, no, what could happen next? And down to the very end, it's full of unpredictable shifts and surprises. And that was Combustible Edison with Cry Me a River. I'm going to finish up now amongst all the car noises. Sorry, I can't get rid of them today. But with a passage that comes from The Cry of the Owl and has a very surreal feel to it. In part probably because Robert Forster is accused of murder. Everyone thinks he's a killer. And yet he's being stalked by the man he supposedly killed, which he knows and nobody else believes. Robert made himself a scotch and water, drank half of it, and fell asleep on the red couch. When he awakened, it was dark, and a few katydids were chanting. It was early for katydids, Robert thought, and it promised a dry summer. He turned on a light, then opened his front door and went out. Katydid, katydidn't, did, katydidn't. He imagined hundreds of insect eyes in great rings around him, all facing him, staring. He stepped off the little porch. There was a quarter moon, midway up in the black sky on his right. His foot kicked a piece of wood, and he picked it up, unconsciously gripping it like a club. He moved towards the dark shadow of the hydrangea bush, walked around it slowly. Nothing, of course. Why had he bothered looking? Nothing ever came if he looked for it. Nothing for him. Poor Robert Forster. His life does not get much better. All right, that about wraps up the time for this episode. So I'll see you next time. Surreal dreams in the noir for you. Happy Noirvember.